welcome to the pod people, and they're everywhere!
They're back!
I'm Matisse Van Rossum, and I'm bugging out.
I'm Cleveland Mosier, and, do you hear that sound overhead? I think it's fans.
It's the government, man. I'm Ben Sheets, but we gotta keep them from watching us.
We gotta prevent the fan uprising.
Fans, helicopters, what's the difference?
Is there?
No.
Oh, okay.
We're talking about Bug. Bug.
Yeah.
This is Ben's pick, the 2006 film by William Friedkin. And that's all I'll say. Ben, why don't you give us an introduction to William Friedkin, the great William Friedkin, and Bug.
Yeah, let's take this fucker off.
So William Friedkin is one of the classic new Hollywood directors, directed some of my personal favorite movies like The Exorcist, Sorcerer, The French Connection. He is definitely known for The Exorcist, most likely.
One of the most famous horror films of all time.
One of the most famous horror movies of all time. But what's interesting about his career is, despite that, he's only done 2 or 3 horror movies, including The Exorcist. Outside of The Exorcist, this is one of them. Bug is a 2006 horror movie based on a stage play by Tracy Letts.
Does the play have the same name? Is it
I
also
believe
called
so.
Bug?
I believe it's also called Bug. Tracy Letts continued collaboration with William Friedkin after this on to the excellent Killer Joe, which is more of a black comedy than this. Tracy Letts is a pretty well-known, well-regarded playwright. He did things like August Osage County, as well as plenty of others.
I can't say I'm super well versed in stage theater.
This movie is about kind of a lonely girl played by Ashley Judd, who just finds out that her abusive ex-boyfriend just got out of prison. She works at kind of a grimy, shitty lesbian bar
In Oklahoma.
One day, one of her friends brings over this really weird guy. She becomes good friends with him. He starts saying crazier and crazier stuff and acting stranger and stranger, and she goes along with it because she doesn't want to be alone. The bond kind of builds between them.
That pretty well sums up the basic plot. You did forget to mention that she lives in like a motel.
Yeah, she lives
just, like, on the side
in
of
a
the
very
highway
isolated
in
motel in the middle of nowhere, bumfuck Oklahoma. It's a very grimy location. The set design was pretty good, honestly.
Yeah, it's a pretty good looking motel room. I think it does a really good job setting up like the sense of isolation at the beginning, like with that long helicopter shot coming in of just like the planes and then zooming in on this like tiny little rinky-dink motel where she lives alone. So it's like she is completely isolated and like closed in on herself, and I think that does a good job to set up her character and why she is so eager to become close to Michael Shannon's character, because like you said, she's really lonely. So having the setting very much reflect her sense of loneliness makes it a lot easier to understand why she lets in this like really weird dude and just like lets him start living at the motel with her.
Yeah, and I think they do a really good job of unpacking the character and kind of expanding on some of the reasonings throughout the movie. She is plagued by these phone calls right at the beginning of the movie where someone's just calling her, not saying anything on the phone.
Yeah, and it's nice too because it's during that same lead-in helicopter shot with the title sequence. So you get like the phone ringing, no one answering. She calls it like hello, and no one answers, and she just hangs up immediately. And it's kind of jarring, and it really brings home that sense of isolation.
Yeah, and it also plays into the themes of surveillance really well.
Yeah.
Because,
that's what I was gonna say.
They're listening and whatnot. This movie definitely veers into kind of the mindset of conspiracy. I wouldn't say the film itself is conspiracy driven.
No, I would agree, and that's actually one of the things I like about it.
Same.
Because you would expect the film to be about like there is some sort of like conspiracy, but we never get any evidence of that. It's always just Michael Shannon and Ashley Judd talking about them being watched and the government having like implanted bugs like in their bodies and shit like that, and but you never actually see any of it. You know, you never see the bugs that are quote unquote infesting them. When the doctor shows up at one point, who Michael Shannon claims was like the army doctor who experimented on him when he was in the military, like we never actually know who that dude is, just that he is a doctor. We know who Michael Shannon thinks he is, but we don't actually know who he is.
Yeah, like it's cool because like he has like some information on what's her name? The
Ashley Judd.
Yeah, like he has some information on her that he shouldn't have. So there's still this degree, but it's possible he could have gained that information from other means. Like it's still all within like a degree of an ambiguity. The film is beautifully ambiguous.
If you recall, her ex-husband was the one who brought him to the motel.
Who would have known those things?
Would have given,
exactly.
Yeah, who would have given him that information, and like how she thinks that, you know, that it's her husband making those calls where he just doesn't say anything and just breathes on the line, and he says that he hasn't been calling her at all.
Yeah, the husband denies it.
So it's like, well, is he just a liar because he's proven himself to be a scumbag, or is the government watching and listening, you know? So I really appreciate that ambiguity, that it's, like you said, Ben, I think you summed it up really well. It's about the mindset of conspiracy and not about conspiracy itself.
Yeah, I think Friedkin does a really great job giving us some distance between buying the conspiracies of the movie. We feel for the characters, but never once do we feel like the conspiracies are necessarily completely legitimate.
No, yeah, I don't think so. I at least just felt like Michael Shannon certainly was crazy, and that like being so confined with his craziness made Ashley Judd crazy. That they sort of developed a shared psychosis.
Yeah.
I never got the impression that anything that they were saying was legitimate,
which is cool. Like it
but they also don't explicitly tell you that it's not,
right? Because
so I do appreciate that.
Yeah, because it is revealed that Shannon's character is like ex-military and like something was going on. So like, you know, potentially like something could have happened, whether it's to the degree he says it is or it's not at all, whether he just has PTSD and that's made him a paranoid.
Well, the doctor said that he was schizophrenic. The doctor tells Ashley Judd that Michael Shannon is straight up schizophrenic.
I mean, having the delusion of bugs is a typical schizophrenic tendency.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say, visually, they do kind of separate the reality of what's happening with the psychosis. You get it, especially in the motel scene, which we'll expand on plenty. But when they push the bed up against the door and everything's like wildly shaking in the room, and you know, everything is getting thrown from side to side, and then we get a shot from outside of the room where it's just completely still, you know, like.
Well, yeah, they do that a couple of times where they both seem to have this shared hallucination of like helicopters like surrounding them. Like you hear the helicopter and there's the wind and the light and it's like an earthquake and everything is shaking. That happens like 2 or 3 times in the movie. But then there is that one time where like it cuts to I think her husband outside, and everything is just like completely calm and quiet, like there's nothing. So that in that sense, like that is very much a hallucination on their part.
Definitely.
Which I think is why it leans a little bit more towards like these people are just crazy. But I think it's like the interesting thing is like you can buy Michael Shannon being a schizophrenic, but the fact that just by spending time with Ashley Judd that she sort of like takes on his illness, you know, at the same time, like their shared psychosis is what I think makes the film really the most interesting, that dynamic, because that isn't really explained, and I haven't studied that a whole lot, so I don't know
It's a real thing.
like what well, yeah, I know it's a real thing, but I don't know like details about how that kind of thing develops and to what extent the psychosis is shared between, you know, multiple people. So I can't say, but I do think that is the probably the most interesting aspect of those characters' dynamic in the film. That was one of the things that I liked the best. I was not surprised to learn that this was an adaptation of a stage play, or it's almost entirely
It's very talky,
dialogue driven. It's except for like really like the couple of times that we see Ashley Judd out of her room, like the one scene where she's at work and then the scene where she's at the grocery store. Other than that, like it's pretty much all in this single location in the hotel room,
which I think makes it feel very claustrophobic.
Yeah, totally.
In a great way. One of the things I want to talk about a little bit with that shared psychosis, though, going back to that a little bit, is it kind of expands on the idea of kind of viruses of thought, which I've always thought is an awesome concept in film.
Oh yeah, like, that's one of the cool things about the title. Like, I mean, bug is multifaceted. There's, you know, you're being bugged, and then also the literal bugs, and then like a virus, like a mind virus.
Yeah, it's like a mind parasite in a way.
Something that you catch,
you know,
catch the bug. Yeah.
Like the last movie I saw that really plays on viruses of speech and thought like that was like Pontypool, which does a great job in more of a zombie setting, playing off of those ideas. But this one really expands on susceptibility to that stuff and more in an authentic way, I think, which is really interesting and honestly really kind of viscerally disturbing to me, because it's so grounded in reality.
Seeing their collective degradation is it's pretty visceral, especially in stuff like where Michael Shannon thinks that the queen bug or the egg sac or whatever has been placed in his tooth because he got a filling when he was in the army. So he thinks that they put the bugs inside his tooth. So he just like gets a pair of needle nose pliers and just like rips his tooth out. That scene was particularly disturbing. I always have problems with like seeing people pull their teeth out. That's one of those things in horror movies that always gives me the heebly-jeeblies, and this scene is I think particularly
the way it was shot too is just so viscerally disturbing.
Yeah, the tension build to that sequence is great too. Like this, you or Great Tooth, you see like Shannon like kind of playing with a lot and commenting on it, and it starts out as just like minor little like just him like fucking with his jaw before you even know, like he's just sort of massaging his cheek. And it's subtle enough at the beginning, and it builds up nicely. There are probably a few moments where I didn't even notice.
And I like that too, because at that point in the film, like Ashley Judd still is not convinced of anything he's saying. You know, she hasn't gone like full blown crazy yet. Mm-hmm. So at that point, like, he's totally losing his mind and ripping his tooth out, and she's just like screaming like, what the fuck are you doing?
Yeah.
So I think that's really great, but it is kind of after that point where she really starts to go downhill.
Yeah, I did feel it was a little interesting that like she sort of goes like from one sequence to the next, like being like, oh, what the fuck are you doing, what's going on, and then relative like the next scene over or so, like she's sort of going along with it fully. Like I didn't feel like I got like her internal like,
I mean, I think
tipping point.
I think she buys it a little before that with the scene where her friend comes over, because that's before he pulls his tooth out, you know? She's kind of explaining this to him, to her friend, and her friend is like, this is crazy. You can't be actually believing this. And there's a certain point where she says, you know, she's talked to Michael Shannon's doctor. She threatens to tell the doctor where Michael Shannon is. And she freaks out because she doesn't want to lose him. Yeah. You know,
the friend tells about it, makes the threat about the doctor, and then Judd freaks out.
Well, I mean, we see that she clearly has some serious abandonment issues and that she's extremely lonely. So even though Michael Shannon is not necessarily a positive influence in her life. He's still better than nothing. I mean, we see that she's been quote unquote abandoned a lot anyway. Like her husband is abusive, and then he goes off to jail. You know, her son was kidnapped or something. Her son disappeared at the supermarket.
Yeah,
Like that's
the greatest character aspect for sure.
Yeah, that and she doesn't know what happened to him, which I think is another great element playing into the idea of conspiracy. Is just like all she can do is speculate on what happened to her son, because like they never discovered anything. Like he was just there and then he wasn't. You know, maybe the government took him or something.
It plays into that feeling of grief with Judd's character really well too.
Right.
Like even throughout the movie, she just is kind of passively grieving about it.
Right.
In a lot of ways.
And searching for a means of escapism, which is a big part. One thing we haven't really mentioned too much is also that her and Michael Shannon both do a whole lot of drugs during the course of the film, like, and which presents another aspect of ambiguity.
Yeah, well,
they start out with them doing like some coke.
She's
and
constantly
heavily.
constantly drinking too. Like we see a couple of times her like get up first thing in the morning and like immediately pour herself like a vodka coke or something. Michael Shannon doesn't really, like when he first shows up, like when her friend brings him over, like he doesn't drink. Like they're like sitting around drinking and like doing coke and smoking weed and shit, and like Michael Shannon's not really doing any of it,
which is cool because eventually he does, and so it sort of plays off that same theme, like of you know, being influenced by other people and catching that bug.
And also, just like it makes sense that if he is a schizophrenic, like if that's to be believed, that like mind altering substances like that
set people off.
Set people off. Apparently, particularly weed has a bad influence on people who suffer from schizophrenia. So like that's kind of when he sort of does relent and start like indulging in some substances. It's also sort of like when he starts to really go overboard with his delusions and stuff like that. His quote unquote delusions. We don't know. He might be completely justified for all we know, but it sure doesn't seem like it, does it?
Well, yeah, that's one of the fun things too. When we first see him looking for bugs after the two have sex on the bed, he's trying to pick these bugs, and you literally can't see them.
Yeah, well, she can't see them either. Like, to the point that she's like, where? And he's like, right there. And he like picks up the bedside lamp and like holds it right next to the sheet. And he's like, right there. And she still can't see it. And then eventually she does start seeing them. But then the friend comes over and doesn't see them, you know, despite the fact that both she and Michael Shannon have like really nasty bites all over them, you know, or rashes and wounds and stuff. I guess you could,
from them picking at themselves,
right?
Potentially.
Which is likely what it is that they think that there's bugs, so they pick at their skin.
Again, quite common among like meth addicts and such.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we never really see them doing anything harder than cocaine. Well, except in that last scene where she's just got a crack pipe.
Yeah.
That the doctor inexplicably hit.
Yeah,
I thought that was really funny. He's like, can I have a drink? And she's like, no. And then he just sees the crack pipe. He's like, can I hit this?
No, really fun stuff. And the cool thing too about like them not being able to see the bugs, like it plays up nicely because they also get a microscope as well, which I love. We don't see. They just like it cuts back to the next sequence, and they just have the microscope there, and they're trying to look through stuff. But like it's an old school microscope, and it can be really easy to just see like the wrong thing in there.
It looks like a kid's microscope.
Yeah, I think it is a child's microscope because she has a bunch of her missing son's toys and stuff, and Michael Shannon was the one who got the microscope out, and we see all the toys scattered around, and Ashley Judd's friend even says like, she's when she gets back, she's not gonna like that you've gotten all these toys.
No, it was her ex-husband that said that.
Oh, that's right. That yeah. But yeah, so it's a child's microscope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fun because
you never
like,
see the bugs.
Yeah, there's still a degree of ambiguity. Maybe they were seeing like some sort of small bugs. Oh, I remember where I was going with that. It's one of my one of the fun little pieces of dialogue is I think it's the first time she does see quotes one of the bugs. She says something along the lines of like, well, why would there be any bugs here? And it's like, lady, you're in a shitty like long stay motel. Like there are mites and bugs crawling everywhere. So even if they are seeing bugs, it's likely they're just mites or whatever else. And they keep like there's some fun dialogue about aphids.
What I like about the microscope thing too is that like we see like Michael Shannon like pricking himself and like taking his blood, and he's saying that like the bugs are in his blood, that they're like living inside him, which is almost certainly a paranoid delusion.
Yeah.
There's that turning point where like he has the microscope out, but also they've already like started like bug proofing the room, was just like the fly paper hanging all over the place,
hanging from the ceiling fans, just spinning around.
I don't know what good that's gonna do for crawling bugs, but it's a cool visual motif, and it's also just starting to show like the degradation of their sanity. But man, like the best part of the movie is when it gets into the third act and they go like full nutso and like coat the room in aluminum foil and plastic and hang up just like dozens of those like electric bug zappers.
Yeah. So all the blue lighting.
Yeah, that's my favorite part of the movie for a lot of reasons, but also like the aesthetic looks great.
It's awesome. Well, we should talk about a couple things before we get into that whole third act, because the third act is so strong that I don't know if we can follow that in a lot of ways. Sure. One of the things I do want to talk about a little bit is how great Michael Shannon is in this movie. Yep. Like, he has such a presence. We see him start out as kind of just a weirdo. He's introduced to the movie because when he's brought over to Ashley Judd's room, he is using the bathroom and she jokes about him being an axe murderer or something. And the first lines we get from him is him just saying multiple times, "I'm not an axe murderer." They do such a great job of building the safety but offbeatness of his character and just throwing it down the rabbit hole into the arc of madness.
Yeah. And throwing like you along with it, which is what I particularly liked about it. Like you do sort of feel like you're strapped in for the ride and brought along on their paranoia. And again, thanks to the ambiguity.
And Michael Shannon just has kind of that, this sounds weird, but kind of a disturbing face in a way.
Well, I mean, like it's a hallmark of his career. I mean, he's almost exclusively played villains after this role, which I think plays in a little negatively, like looking back at the film. Like if I'd watched this, and I wonder how it would have felt like if I'd watched this when it came out in 2006, if I would have felt the same way. I think I would have, because again, like he's just kind of got that face. Which is, I mean, helped make his career. So I see it as a positive, and he plays villains incredibly well. I've loved almost all of the roles he's played.
Well, it's interesting because this was his breakout role, we should mention. He did the stage play version of this with Tracy Letts for about a decade before this. He had some minor movie roles before this. He was in like Bad Boys 2 and stuff like that. But this was his real breakout role. The thing about it is it's interesting you mention him playing villains after this, because you're right on the money. But it's interesting because he's not necessarily a villain in this movie.
In this movie, no. I mean, he
just has such a disturbing presence that
he has, and he I think he ultimately has a negative effect on Ashley Judd, but it's not like he's trying to be evil. Like fucking Harry Connick Jr. is much more of a villain in this movie than Michael Shannon is,
and he's completely sane.
Yeah,
I mean
Michael Shannon just comes across as like mentally unwell. You know?
Yeah,
which I think it's good that they didn't try to make him villainous, because there is such a stereotype of like insane villains, you know, that like
madness
that, like,
and
mental instability leads to villainy. I appreciated that they didn't try to make Michael Shannon the villain, even though he has an overall negative effect on Ashley Judd.
madness in horror movies is so often terribly done.
Yeah.
You just get the insane serial killer, the crazed lunatic, and it's very rare that you get such a real portrait of mental illness.
Well, yeah, most of the time in horror movies, when you're dealing with like mental illness, you're dealing with like psychopathy, and Michael Shannon's character is not a psychopath in this movie. He's just probably a paranoid schizophrenic, you know, which is a pretty horrible existence. I think it's one of the things that, like, to be a schizophrenic, I think would be one of the truly like most tragic existences that you can have, just like not even being able to trust your own mind. I think that is part of what makes this movie a horror movie, is not knowing who is crazy and who isn't, and like what is real and what isn't. Like, the unknown is terrifying.
Yeah. I think this movie is one of the few movies that hits that mark so perfectly. I would compare it in a lot of ways to Repulsion.
Yeah.
Where like the mental illness is very real, but it's not caricatured in any way.
Right. And similar to Repulsion, it all takes place in like an isolated single location.
It's neat too, because like to kind of further like expound on that point about like his schizophrenia, like there are, from what small amount of information I have, like and understand about it, which again is very small, but I do believe like you can like be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and like it can be like at lesser stages like relatively treatable, and like you can be like a functioning member of society.
Just like any sort of mental illness, there's high functioning and low functioning. Like, there are plenty of people who live, perfectly, normal, for the most part, normal lives as high functioning schizophrenics. Yeah. But I think that I guess in this case I was referring to people like Michael Shannon's character in this that are completely incapable of functioning because of their delusions.
What I like about it is like he starts out like relatively functional, like he looks like he seems to act fairly normal, like he's avoiding like booze and whatnot. Like he has some strange quirks about his personality, but he seems like entirely functional, and probably, given if his character is paranoid schizophrenic and not actually, being besieged by some sort of conspiracy, then if he was to like be in a better scenario and like have the proper help like sought out for him, like he could probably still be a regularly functioning member of society. Like which really keys into like the believability and authenticity of his written character. Like, I think that in better circumstances, if his character was that and not besieged, he could have been well taken care of and like done all right. Like, which is really cool to me.
Well, I think what really set the character off was he mentions that he was in the Gulf War, and the things he experienced there and the horrible atrocities he saw kind of triggered that latent cognitive problems, caused him to be discharged, to be hospitalized, and all that stuff for it. And that's a real thing. Gulf War syndrome was, and still is, a huge deal upon people who were fighting in that war. Like 40 to 60,000 plus people experience, PTSD, chronic fatigue, mental issues similar to what Michael Shannon is experiencing because of the Gulf War. So it really adds a tragic bit to it, because there is that factor of, he probably would have been fine if he hadn't had this experience in the war, and
then like after that been better treated afterwards.
Well, if he is a schizophrenic, like, schizophrenia is a genetic disorder. What he dealt with in the Gulf War and PTSD could very well have exacerbated that and made it manifest earlier and like more intensely in his life. But if he was genetically predisposed to it,
But it could have easily stayed latent, and the events and stress is what triggered it.
Yeah, that's what I just said. Yep.
He is still predisposed. Yes, that is correct. What I'm just saying that, you know, it's not necessarily true that like it would have actually affected him if not for things like this. You know, like just because you have a family history of it doesn't mean you're automatically going to be schizophrenic, you know.
Well, no, but if you are but schizophrenia is genetic.
Right. If he does suffer from schizophrenia, that means that it was something that was in him all along and that the events might have brought it out, but it still would have manifested at some point in his life, maybe to lesser degrees or much later in his life than it did, but it would have at some point been an issue for him, regardless of whether it was as intense or not. That's all I'm saying. But I agree with you that it makes his character much more of a tragic figure. I think he and Ashley Judd are both pretty tragic figures because they both have their own fair share of trauma and problems interacting with society that draws them together and just is a really, you know, toxic feedback loop that just like fuels their own problems until it just snowballs into like full-blown insanity. And I think that is a very tragic thing. Like I said, Michael Shannon's not a villain. You know, but what happens to them is sad.
Yeah, and it's disturbing, you know, more than anything.
Yeah.
It's a unique kind of horror where we're scared for the characters a lot and what they're going to end up doing to themselves in a lot of ways.
Well, they're largely sympathetic.
You know?
Absolutely.
And like,
well, it's scary too because it feels real, you know? It's something that does happen to people and that, you know, can happen to anybody, you know.
Oh, for sure.
And you never know until it was happening. So it is that very real kind of horror where it's like, oh my god, I hope that I never turn out like this, you know.
Right.
But you could.
Yeah, like it's cool. It really gets at like the root of the word sympathy, which is I suffer with you.
Yeah.
And we do as audience members, like we feel the pain right along with them, like as they experience it, which really brings us into to be concerned and care for the characters and really just hate the things that happens to them and really hold that tension nicely.
Yeah.
I'm curious how close the adaptation is to the stage play.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually have never seen the stage play. I know they were both written by Tracy Letts, so
it's probably fairly close. I guess I'm just wondering how much of the dialogue is direct because the film does play out so much like a stage play that I feel like you could probably, you know, just take a lot of the dialogue directly and just put it in and add camera directions and stuff. Speaking of camera directions, I think we should talk a little bit about the visual style of the film. And some of the editing choices and just the general aesthetic, because that's where most of my problems came in. And I know you agree with me too, Cleve. It's a film from 2006.
Yes.
And we've said before, I'm pretty sure on the show, that the aughts are like one of the worst aesthetically dated decades for film. I think especially the early to mid aughts.
Yeah, early digital. Oof.
It's something about a combination of that early digital and the first like overusage of like shaky cam and handheld camera, which I don't think is overall a problem. I think there's plenty of ways to do it right, but it's just like there's something about like the aesthetic of films from the early to mid 2000s that I just don't think has aged well at all. And I think the beginning of this film suffers from that for me. By the end, I was very visually on board, but that's because in the end, the setting becomes so stylized, and at that point, when they're sort of like in the throes of their madness, like the really like loose and improvisational camera movement, and the weird sort of frenetic editing, and the jump cuts and stuff, that worked for me by that point. My problem is that all of that stylistic stuff, in terms of camera movement and editing is also there at the beginning before either of them have really started to go crazy. And I didn't understand it while I was watching it at the time. It stood out for me in a jarring way.
Right. The cinematography for me, like, it doesn't have the same arc that the characters do. It starts out crazy,
right?
And we don't get to. And, you know, because it's the lens we're viewing it through, we start crazy, and by the end of it, we match them, as opposed to sort of getting the opportunity to be crazy with, or to succumb to the craziness with them.
I agree. It was mostly the jump cuts.
In a lot of ways, I would compare it to, in a weird way, Mother. You know,
which is another film
which is our first movie, the first movie we talked about on the podcast. But similarly, you know, has such a enhanced stylistic feel that you're along for the ride. And in a similar way, I feel like the feeling of this movie is, from the beginning, is so off kilter that it feels voyeuristic at times, which plays into the themes of surveillance. And additionally, like, you never feel comfortable in what you're seeing.
I agree, and I still think that it would have been more effective had they lulled me into a false sense of security in the beginning before I know that anything is wrong, and then they start making me feel uncomfortable with the characters. I think that would have, for like me as a viewer, would have made the emotional journey of the film all that much more successful, rather than starting me off uncomfortable and having me notice things that I don't like about the editing and the camera movement and stuff like that, and then building me into, it's like, oh, okay, now I see why they're doing that. I think that it would have been much more successful if, like you said, Cleveland, if there was an arc to it, just like there's an arc to
it's an interesting point. Well, I agree.
And I want to say, even still, like, documentary style, like, through the whole thing, like, I really like documentary style. I like shoulder mount shots, because it can make you feel more like you're in the room, head bob simulation, etc.
Yeah.
Like it's great, but at times it felt somewhat overbaked. Like, there are several sequences where a character is monologuing early on, and the camera keeps like zooming in on punches.
Yeah, the little punch ins didn't work super well for me. Otherwise the handheld stuff was fine. I didn't mind the movement. Like you said, the documentary style, especially because it's so dialogue heavy, it reminded me of like mumblecore films in a lot of ways.
It reminded me of the punch-ins almost reminded me of Cassavetes at times, especially, you know, with a woman under the influence being so related to schizophrenia too. I'm sure Friedkin was somewhat inspired by some of the stylistic trappings of that, which I didn't mind too much. I can understand the influence. The one thing I'll say about the camera not having the same arc is
it's mostly the editing more than the camera.
Yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from there. I think it worked to keep a distance from feeling in the shoes of those characters' journey, but I don't think it was perfectly done at the same time. I think it's good to make us not feel like we're going insane with them. Friedkin does a pretty good job of keeping a slight distance between that throughout the movie.
Yeah,
I find that interesting because, like, I think that the most compelling part about, like, the writing, like, as we've already, like, fully dissected, is that we are sort of brought along with them. Like, I think that that's the most effective thing about the.
But there's always a distance to it.
There is a distance.
And the more you can close that gap, the less you can, like, remind them of the framing, and more just putting them in the
there's
painting.
a distance, but also, like we brought up a few minutes ago, is that there's an aspect of sympathy, of suffering along with the characters, and I think that the balance between distance and sympathy in like the third half is good. I think that, like, you do suffer along with them without ever feeling like you have become them, but I still think that there's a way to, in the first
it's a fine line to balance.
I guess. Okay, all right. I think I thought of a good way to sum this up for me is, I think that in the first couple of acts, I would have preferred the camera work and the editing to keep me at distance from the characters, but instead it put me at a distance from the film itself. In the sense that I was consciously noting specific decisions they were making and being like, I don't know if that really works for me. I think a lot of that comes from just like me being somebody, all of us being people who view films with like a particularly critical eye because we have to, you know, because it's what we do. So maybe somebody who was not so critical of film would not pick up on that or have it bother them. But for me, it's just like
the scores would reflect differently though.
It takes me out of the film because it starts making me question the decisions of the filmmaker and like, well, why did you do that? Why wouldn't you do this instead?
But I think it's for reasons that like most people would recognize. Like I think that most people like with the job
I think
would be reminded that they're watching this through a camera.
Yeah, more than anything, it's just
sure.
I think it's that 2000 syndrome.
Yeah,
you know,
and I think
I think that makes what's a minor problem feel more major. Just because it feels more dated.
Yeah, no, that could very well be, which I think is still a perfectly valid criticism of films is how they age and how they date, because like truly the best films, no matter what decade they're from, still hold up really well in modern day. So I think that's something you have to consider as a filmmaker when you're making a film, is how timeless will this film be? That's a whole different discussion. I think that you're right on the money though with about that fucking like early to mid 2000s aesthetic. And another thing I was going to mention is that like the little punch-ins while people are talking, I can't see shit like that anymore without thinking of fucking like sitcoms like The Office and like Parks and Rec and like documentary style sitcoms where like somebody looks at the camera and they zoom in.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because this preceded that in a lot of ways.
Right. Which is a good distinction to make, is that at the time that had less of a stigma,
a contextual
association.
Even then, like one punch-in is fine, but like three punch-ins like in only a few sentences of a monologue,
punch-in, yeah.
Like that's where it got me, because again, I like that style, but just doing like again and again and again, and it's like, stop zooming, I get it, like you know, and it just I keep being
again I think it was inspired by Cassavetes in a lot of ways. Cassavetes uses punch-ins and zooms very liberally like that.
That's very true.
And I don't mind it personally. If you're not used to that style of filmmaking, I could see it.
Well, no, I think
a bother.
It's contextual also. Like if it's a campier film, or like a movie where I'm not really supposed to, being in the film isn't the point of the film, it's fine. Like, you know, if I'm gonna watch a wackier like RoboCop style film, or even like an 80s kind of saccharine horror film, I wouldn't mind it there. Like I think even then, like multiple punch-ins if it's like something that heavily stylized, I think would fit in something a little bit like campier and more intentionally artificial. My issue is that like that style, like documentary style filmmaking, is often used to create a sense of genuine, or a sense of like authenticity.
Kind of fly on the wall.
Exactly. It's used to create a sense of authenticity. So when you have it being sort of used artificially, like authenticity being used artificially is very tricky. And like you were saying earlier, Ben, it's a fine line to walk. And I think that this film suffers on that front.
Yeah, somewhat. I think it is very dependent on context. In Cassavetes stuff, it doesn't bother me. In like mumblecore films, it doesn't bother me. Something about in this setting, it's just because I don't think I'm
mostly in the first act, right?
Yeah. In like I said, once they go full tilt into the end of the film, which I think we should get into here in a minute. Once they go full tilt into that, all of that stuff just, I think, further heightens the mindset of the characters. And at that point, I'm totally sold. It's just when there's like the really mundane stuff happening at the beginning, and there's like seemingly unmotivated jump cuts and like weird punch-ins on moments of dialogue that seemingly don't deserve that import. it's stuff like that it takes me out of it in a sort of uncomfortable way. But let's talk about that third act a little bit, because I think that is the point where the film like truly won me over overall. For a lot of the first half of the movie, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, I'm really on board with the characterization and the dialogue, but I don't know if I like the style. And then we get into that third act, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is fucking awesome. This is great.
Yeah, I mean, the third act is what stuck with me.
Yeah,
it's why I picked this movie.
Yeah, it makes the film.
The last time I saw this movie was back in high school, I think, and I've shown it to a few people since then. The third act is always what catches people because it is so stunning, covering the walls with aluminum foil and putting up those bug lanterns is so evocative.
Yeah, just like they've sealed themselves inside their tinfoil hat, like quite literally.
Yeah, exactly.
It's great.
It works so well with the conspiracy ideas. I was reading some behind the scenes stuff, and apparently they had a lot of problems shooting in the aluminum foil room like that because everything was so reflective,
cameras,
yeah,
I believe that.
I applaud them for doing it successfully.
How long it took them to just build that fucking set, to just like cover everything with plastic and foil. That must have probably taken a day or two in and of itself.
Yeah, see, what I'm thinking about too is how you do it in the stage play. You'd have to have like the taped together like tinfoil stuff and just pull it up like in the middle of a
they probably almost certainly have something like that, or
it's gonna be a loud scene transition,
or just have like different walls and just like wheel out different scenes.
Yeah, that's what you'd almost have to do. So it's
that's probably
it doesn't go dark and then the stage just sounds really crinkly for a little bit.
Right. But yeah, that at the beginning of that sequence is when the doctor shows up, and I think he's an interesting character too, because all we've been told about him up to this point is that like he's an evil government scientist who's like using soldiers as his guinea pigs and like trying to build like this bioweapon or whatever of like infecting people with like bugs that they then spread to other people and shit like that. But it's like he comes in and he doesn't give very much information about himself, but he's just like, I know Michael Shannon, like, he hasn't had his medicine for a while, like, he's a paranoid schizophrenic. There's that weird aspect where he does just, like, hit the crack pipe. A government scientist probably wouldn't do that, but also, like, a doctor probably would not
that's
do
the
that.
interesting
there are a lot
thing
of doctors,
to it.
that get up to that sort of thing.
That's
so
the
it is kind of believable.
The interesting thing about it to me is by having him hit the crack pipe like that, it puts his authenticity into question.
Right.
Exactly. In a big way.
But like it's cool because like I mean, look at Timothy Leary, right? Like that it's a thing that happens like with doctors and scientists, which is fun.
Timothy Leary is, a renowned scientist, but he wasn't like a licensed doctor in the same way. Well,
no, but he was a career professional. Like
yes, but licensed doctors
sampled his own wares, like
right. But he was experimenting with psychedelics and like unlocking like different parts of consciousness and shit like that. Mm-hmm. He wasn't just like smoking crack with crazy people in dingy hotel rooms.
Yeah,
and like his first experience with LSD, the first experience with LSD was accidental. And that's his, like he accidentally got some of it on him and had a great bike ride back home. Like he didn't stop there, which is part of the fun. So that's all I'm getting at. It's like it is, the believability is still there, but it's also really unique.
It does put his authenticity,
especially as Michael Shannon's psychiatric doctor. You would assume he's that stable base. Exactly. And by having him smoke a crack pipe, you're like, how stable is he really? Which I think is a great effect.
Yeah, because he also like expresses some regret about how he's handled Michael Shannon.
Yeah.
As well. So you can see that even he's open to like not being as good at his job as he could be.
I just love how ambiguous that character is, because it's like you can be fairly certain that he has been medically treating Michael Shannon to some extent, but to what extent and in what context is left totally ambiguous.
Yeah. Does he have regret over like letting Michael Shannon like escape as his project, or does he have regret over like not taking care of him properly?
Right. Is he a sinister figure, or is he a caring figure? You know?
It's weird too, because it seems like he's playing up the delusions as well. And part of that, you know, is him understanding, you know, severity of the situation.
Well, yeah,
but
he's
at the same time, it makes it feel more authentic to the characters.
Right.
You know?
Well, he's having that long conversation with Ashley Judd, and when he realizes that she's sort of like broken down too, he starts telling her that, like, to try to convince her to like let Michael Shannon go. It's like, well, I can take him back to the base or whatever, and we'll remove the bugs from his body, you know? It'll be a perfectly standard operation. But it's like, is he telling her that earnestly, or is he lying to her, playing into her delusions to get her to trust him more? Which it's likely that one, but even so, it is never explicitly stated.
Yeah, I'd be really curious to know like what the professional standard is for, or like the protocol is for taking care and looking after someone who is having a schizophrenic outbreak. Like how much are you supposed to like play into their fantasy to kind of help cushion them, or do you like straight up try and break their fantasy, which could be very unhealthy?
That I'd
be really curious to know. Like, I think that's.
I mean, whatever the standard is, smoking a crack pipe, then saying you'll remove the bugs,
right?
Does not seem like the correct protocol.
That does seem wrong.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, after that, we get like the only like truly violent moment in the movie where Michael Shannon finally comes out of the bathroom and he's naked, and he starts trying to tell Ashley Judd that the doctor is like an android.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'll show you. And he just takes a knife and he just like stabs the fucking shit out of him, just murders him. And it's really graphic and bloody. And he's like digging around in his intestines. He's like, it's not blood, it's lubricant, see? And he's like rubbing it on Ashley Judd.
And his own face.
And on his own face.
Like tasting it even.
He's like, you see, it's not blood, it's lubricant, it's fake blood. And it's just like, nah, you just, I mean, they don't show us, but it's like, nah, you just murdered that dude.
And then they go on a big rant for about 10 minutes between the two of them, kind of justifying everything and furthering the conspiracy in their head. And this is like the climactic, you know,
probably my
dialogue of the movie, yeah. And I think it's fantastic.
It's really mostly a monologue from Ashley Judd. Like, Michael Shannon is participating, but he's mostly like egging her on in the extent that like he's letting her like put the pieces together. He's like, yeah, and why would they do that? And then like she just kind of rambles on. It's very much like a monologue from her, and I think it's awesome because it's like that's when their personalities have like sort of fully fused, and she is like completely given herself up to the conspiracy, and like watching her logic and the way she puts it together is like watching those fucking conspiracy theory YouTube videos.
Yes.
Where it's like you see the path that they're taking to like reach these conclusions, but it's just like a series of like logical missteps,
bigger stretches, you know,
right.
Bigger reaches
that leave ultimately more questions than answers.
The interesting thing is I've shown this movie to a few people over the years. There's a few times where like I've shown this to people and like that scene has elicited laughter from people because it is so absurd.
Oh, yeah.
And I think part of it is because we're so distanced from the reality of that situation. That it can be funny to people,
to be, yeah.
You know?
I liked it in particular because, like, I love wacky conspiracy theories, like, for fun, like, you know, and to giggle at, but, like, it's neat because it starts out with, like very legitimate, Shannon starts out with very legitimate and proven things, like MK Ultra, which is, like, government documented, like,
right.
That happened, you know, like, a small branch of the CIA did do tests on college students, like, you know, What came of it, they burned most of the records, we don't know, who's to say, but, like, everything past that is just fucking nutso town. And it's fun to me because like you could fucking Wikipedia that. Like that's well documented. And again, like most of the shitty YouTube conspiracy videos and stuff, it starts out with something that's like that like the government did that's probably legitimately bad, and then it very quickly spins off into speculation, and it doesn't know when to.
They mention like the Tuskegee syphilis testing and stuff.
Most of those like really diehard conspiracy theorists are obviously not proponents of Occam's razor at all, because like they always choose the things that have the most variables rather than the least, like things that bring up the most questions rather than the least, and they just present it as like ironclad fact.
Right. And then they're on to the next one before they can really track down and research
it allows them, because they believe one thing, it allows them to make a further leap and then a further leap, and it's just like a complete downward spiral. And we get to watch that happen to Ashley Judd in real time, and it's great. Talking about kooky shit that like they implanted Michael Shannon with like drones that would activate the bugs, but they implanted like the queen bug in her, and that's why the bugs didn't show up until after the first time they had sex, because he transferred the nano drones to her that activated the queen bug in her, and then they both became infested. And it's just
it goes whack town.
It's just absolute nonsense. The like sound of the helicopters outside is just like building and building. It's like the government is finally coming. And it ends with them setting themselves on fire.
Good old immolation.
Like you do. And then we see outside from the hotel room that there's nothing out there, you know. I do like that the very last thing they say to each other before they set themselves on fire is "I love you so much." Even at the end, at least they felt loved.
Well,
at least they felt that companionship. You know?
One thing that I love is, I think the key moment to unpacking that is earlier in the movie. I think right after they have sex, Ashley Judd asks Michael Shannon's character why he doesn't like being with women or having relationships.
Yeah, because he mentions earlier that he's sort of given up on that he hasn't been with a woman in several years.
And he mentions this idea of having like something in the core of you, something pure, uncorrupted by others and untouched by others. Relationships and things like that can infect that. And in a lot of ways, that's what we see.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely
in
what
the
happens.
movie. You know,
yeah, he talks
directly.
about like somebody else's personality like invading yours and corrupting like your pure core self. And that's exactly what they do to each other. They invade each other, and I think that thematically that is addressed really well, and it can only really end with their destruction by the end. So I found the ending to be pretty satisfying, tragic but satisfying.
Yeah, it's not too often you come across like characters in narrative who are like borderline asexual as well, or just like asexual characters like aren't that often like portrayed, and I find that
I think they even really mention that they just had sex the one time, that like even after that they've been living together but they haven't been sleeping together or anything. It was just like the one experience that sort of like kickstarted the whole thing. And we don't have to get into it, but that is one of the weirdest sex scenes I've ever seen in any movie when they bang. It's like, I think weird in a good way, because it's like, it's sensual, but at the same time, like, really uncomfortable.
Yeah,
there's a lot of Michael Shannon's face,
it's not erotic really at all. You know, like
it's sensual, but it's not.
But
erotic,
like everyone is so wet and sweaty and. Like it's
not in a good way.
It's gritty in a way.
Yeah. And that is, you know, sort of like the catalyzing incident that like it Michael Shannon, you know, is at that point relatively stable. Like he's a little weird, but he, you know, he's functional, and same with Ashley Judd. It's like that when they literally invade each other, that like they've also in a way, he has planted quote unquote drones inside her. He has infected her with his madness, and she is, through her own insecurities, fueling his. So it's just like a really negative feedback loop. It's really well done. I'd be very curious to see the stage play. I'm not usually one for the theater, but I would check this one out, just out of curiosity. I feel like there's probably somewhere online where you can watch like a recording of it.
I would definitely recommend watching Killer Joe as well. It came out 4 or 5 years after this, but it's very much the same gritty, grimy aesthetic of this movie, taken a step further. It's Friedkin and Letts again, but it's more of a black comedy. Has Matthew McConaughey in it, Juno Temple. It really takes kind of those core, grimy Oklahoma aesthetics and just pushes it even further.
Word. You want to rate?
Yeah, I think we're good to rate.
Why don't you start, Ben?
Okay. Well, I think this movie is a very interesting movie, and while there's some stylistic choices that have dated a little poorly, I think overall the themes and ideas presented in this movie are really strong. The portrayal of madness in this movie hits that perfect point of representation that you don't see in many horror movies, and I think it's very disturbing. We're scared for the characters, just as scared as we are by the characters a lot of the time, if not more, which I think is such an interesting thing in horror movies that I don't feel like I see very often. The acting is incredible. Ashley Judd is awesome. Michael Shannon is awesome. Even Harry Connick Jr. as the abusive ex-boyfriend, I think, does a fantastic job. Overall, I think this is a really solid movie. Interesting enough that I would recommend it to check out if you like Friedkin or you like kind of off-the-wall, disturbing horror movies. Yeah, so I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. I think it's a really strong movie.
Incredible acting. Incredible narrative, wonderful dialogue, great set dressing as well. Like, there are so many great things about this movie, and also like some of my favorite subject matter. As I said, I love conspiracy. It's so much fun to just like hop down some sort of batshit rabbit hole and to be or to be dragged down to that sort of rabbit hole in this case, and themes of madness and whatnot. Like this film does such a good job with all of those things, or at least the core narrative does, in ways that would make me think that the stage play is fantastic. Like I would definitely like be very keen to see it. The biggest things that really that bothered me about the film, like I said, was like the first 2 acts with the cinematography, and also I didn't really get into it as much, but the editing sort of plays its hand a little early with like some of the like shots of the fan and the helicopter stuff before the characters are experiencing that. So it's sort of like I felt like a magician sort of like kind of telling you like what the magic trick they're about to perform is, and it had me sort of questioning the beginning of the film, and a little sad to see that like included in like what could have been like something so much closer to a perfect adaptation. So I'm gonna say for me it was 3 pods. I really liked a lot of aspects of it, but it's always hard for me when I see something that I could have like loved that much more, and I feel could have really been brought home, suffer from something like that, and keep it from being like the movie it even could have been for me. So I'll say 3 pods. I'll say 3 pods, but it's a strong 3. It's a strong 3.
Yeah, I thought that it was overall a pretty solid film. I did have some problems with it, and it led me to focus a little too heavily on like the filmmaking decisions rather than focusing on the characters and the story in a way that I found kind of disappointing.
Especially considering the director.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And just like the aesthetic, I just thought had not aged well, at least in the first couple of acts, including the cinematography and the editing, stuff that you've brought up already. Overall, though, I thought narratively it was quite strong. It had really good thematic development. The characters were intriguing and layered and sympathetic. The acting is stellar. Great performances from Ashley Judd and Michael Shannon. And it really won me over hard in that third act. I would say that if you're not sold in the beginning, if you watch this movie, like, stick around till the end, it's worth it. But I do think that it kind of stumbles a bit out of the gate at the beginning and didn't really capture me as early as I would have liked. So I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5, which will give it an average of 3.7 out of 5 pods. It's, if your only exposure to William Friedkin is stuff like The Exorcist and The French Connection, this is probably going to be a bit of a weird one, but I would overall recommend it. I would say it's worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of like stage plays and like really dialogue heavy narratives, a lot of just people talking to each other. It does that really well, man. Like the writing is tight. 3.7 out of 5 pods for Bug.
So this movie is all about conspiracy. So I have a mini segment for us with this movie. I was looking online and I found an article that has conspiracy theories and theories about the plot of this movie.
Oh God, conspiracy theories about a movie about conspiracy? Fuck
Yeah.
me.
Love it.
This is by the writer, Films for Weirdos with Wild Hearts and Soaring Souls. That's their username. So I'm gonna...
It's their username?
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
It's a hell of a username.
So I'm gonna give you a couple of these theories, and they have several paragraphs about each one of these. But the first one is Peter, Michael Shannon's character, equals Lloyd, the kid that disappeared.
Wait, what? That he...
Peter has a full explained backstory. And
So, in the play, Agnes is 44 years old. She lost her son Lloyd 10 years previous in the grocery store when he was 6. This would make Lloyd about 16 during the film's time frame. Surely Michael Shannon's character looks older than 16, while Judd's character looks more like 34 than 44. Still, there are several instances in this film where I strongly felt Peter could have been Agnes's son Lloyd.
That's a big yikes for me.
No.
Big yikes.
No.
First, there is no explanation as to how/why Peter wandered to that part of Oklahoma. Oddly, RC, quote-unquote, introduces Peter to Agnes, supposedly by mere chance. But what if Peter was tracking his birth parents? If he indeed was kidnapped and tested upon by various governmental agencies, perhaps he somehow learned the process where at least one of his biological parents resided. Maybe he was simply looking for answers as to why all these bad things happened to him. This would explain why he's absent in the scene where RC and Agnes party, almost implying that he was snooping around the house, as well as why he pulls out Lloyd's toys.
Big note.
Yeah, so then he, knowing that Ashley Judd was his mom, he's just like, yeah, I guess I'll fuck my mom.
Yeah, awful. So
a 16-year-old kid looked like a 30-something Michael Shannon. Yeah, I only have one thing to say to that, and that is Occam's razor.
Yep.
Yes, so the next one is Peter as Agnes's delusion. In the film's cover photo, we see Michael Shannon's face hidden within Judd's. This goes along with the theory many hold...
That's not in the movie. Neat.
The theory many hold that perhaps Peter was all a delusion to Agnes.
Except he interacts with
or
multiple people.
Perhaps Peter's character was part of her psyche, like a split personality.
I could buy that if he didn't interact with any of the other characters, but there are a couple of scenes where
she's not
there, and Michael Shannon is interacting directly with Harry Connick Jr. So
and referring to him as Peter and saying I forgot your name and shit.
I'm gonna go like
no.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and say that one's just absolute bunk as well.
There's plenty of ambiguous, like, legitimate conspiracy things, like, you could get it, that we've already gotten to about this movie.
It's more
like,
plausible to believe that Peter was part of Agnes's split personality.
No.
Although the film never gives clues that Agnes's mental faculties are that deteriorated. Still, there are certain scenes that make us question Agnes's state of mind. In the beginning, we see Agnes close up and witness her reactions to the phone ringing. In a mild state of paranoia, she says something like, "Damn you, Jerry, I could get the cops after you," while a moment later she's laughing at herself, as if it can't possibly be Jerry.
What?
In the scene when her and RC party, 1 minute Aggie is up at the freezer, and the next she is on the couch laughing, presumably way more wasted. It's these shots that don't show us happenings in between that might be clues for us in figuring out Agnes's state of mind.
So jump cuts are clues now?
1 minute she's sure it was Jerry calling, calm yet bold in her prediction. Yet another minute she's vulnerably uncertain.
No. Once again, Occam's razor.
Okay, so this one's called Dr. Sweet. If Dr. Sweet wasn't a delusion, he certainly wasn't a doctor. Even in 1991, doctors and psychiatrists don't go out looking for their patients. And they don't generally care about their welfare outside the office.
What?
I don't think that's true.
I think doctors are people too. Last time I checked.
His smoking
wrong,
whatever in the pipe did not signify his gaining Agnes's trust, in my opinion, as he still tells her he sees the bugs too.
We've been over that.
Yeah.
Also point of gaining trust, but whatever.
When someone is having a delusion or is in psychosis, you're not supposed to play along with their delusion, driving them further into it. Obviously, you're not supposed to say they're wrong and persecute them either, but there are other ways of handling the situation.
Okay. I don't think that proves that he's not a doctor. He might be a bad doctor, which we have addressed.
Yeah, we've unpacked that, yeah.
We unpacked that.
I had a theory that maybe Dr. Sweet and Jerry were the same person. Jerry mentions having a sweet tooth. Although this would only work as part of Peter's or Agnes's delusion.
Right, because they both know who Jerry is. And Michael Shannon recognizes Dr. Sweet, so that one's maybe the most plausible out of all of these, but I still think it's
This is a great example though of what we were talking about earlier. Like with the conspiracy theorists like trying to tie red strings to make points and they just get tangled up in the strings.
Yeah, man. Totally.
Like, yeah.
Okay, so there's
There's
one
no chain of
more.
logic.
There's one more. So this one's called RC, who's Agnes's friend. RC is another character I was suspicious of. While many claimed RC was the quote-unquote reality check in the situation, I found her behavior strange as well. Why was Peter in a lesbian bar? And if this was his first time in the area, how did RC know him? And if she didn't, what made her immediately trust him and consider him harmless?
First off, actually, that brings up, to answer the why was Peter at a lesbian bar, that actually is a cool character trait aspect. Like, he would go to a place like that because being asexual and whatnot, he would probably feel somewhat more comfortable there.
Right, he's not there trying to pick up women, and he knows that none of the women there are going to be interested in him because they're gay.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't thought about that fits well into his character, and also answers why that's a dumb question.
Yes, exactly. When she makes a phone call during their party, she dials a number and literally starts talking as if the line didn't even ring, or better yet, she was faking the phone call as an excuse to leave. For those that felt the phone ringing or not ringing was key to the film's plot, what if the phone wasn't working at all? That means RC was playing into Aggie's delusion as well, not to mention leaving Agnes alone with Peter, a man she supposedly just met.
Yeah, that's a reach, too.
Reach and a half.
This person has done a bad job of convincing me of any of these theories.
Yeah, so those were the main conspiracies they had, and man, are they a stretch.
Fantastic. They're all garbage, which I think is a great transition into a word from our sponsor this week.
Oh, yeah, so this one is brought to you by Catkin's Conspiracy String. Looking for a red string to tie your conspiracies together? Seek no further than Catkin's Conspiracy String. We got your yarn, so you can spin yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Catkins. It's all over my apartment now. Just the way I like it. Yeah, okay, so that will bring us to the end of this week's episode. Next week, I'm not going to tell you what we're doing because it's going to be a surprise. It's a very special, exciting episode that we have coming next week. And that's all I'm going to say. So if you like surprises, tune in next week.
It's a conspiracy. Somewhere in the video we've hinted towards it, but you have to unpack the whole thing and maybe rewind it twice to hear all of it. And then you'll know what we're playing next week.
Maybe we've been leaving you clues this whole time.
So you just want me to warp.
If you like the show, if you like the show, leave us a positive rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. Hit those 5 stars. Leave us a nice comment. Share an episode with your friends. Bring us more people so that we may
podify them.
That we may gently spit our nice thoughts and opinions deeply into their ear holes. Follow us on Twitter at podpeoplepod. We're still running the bracket. Are we at this point?
At this point, we're probably done. Yeah.
We'll have an update on that next time, maybe. If you follow us on Twitter, you'd already know by now. So do that. Follow us on Letterboxd if you want to see a list of all the films we've talked about on the show. Our average ratings, links to those episodes, letterboxd.com/podpeoplepod. Follow me on Twitter at Mr. Van Awesome for random shit. I don't know.
I'm really glad you brought up the point about how we infect people with their pod stuff, because I wanted to get a shout out there for my new band, Cleveland Mosier and the Spitting Ear Holes. Yeah, we're really rocking it, and we've got some good bops.
You said it was pirate punk, right?
Oh yeah, pirate punk. We call it avant-garde. And okay, but for real though, you can find me primarily on my art station under Cleveland Mosier, and you can also find some cool tweets we're rocking out for It Stares Back under Light Arc Studios, our company account. Yeah, keep your ears to the rails. We got that demo coming soon. It looks like we're going to be at ECGC, East Coast Game Con in Raleigh from April 16th to 18th. We're going to have a booth, and we're going to be demoing It Stares Back. So y'all better come out and support. It's going to be a hell of a time.
Yeah, if you're in the area and you like video games and spookies, yeah, pick up a ticket for East Coast Games Con. I don't think they're too terribly expensive. And come find us. If you come to our booth and you mention that you heard this on this episode, that you listened to the show, we'll give you something special.
Absolutely,
I don't know. We'll figure it out.
Most definitely.
So yeah, if you like video games and you're in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, check out ECGC.
Yep, and I'm at Mr. Sheets on Twitter. Can you smell what The Rock is cooking? I can.
All right. Well, thank you as always for listening. And check back with us next week for a very special surprise episode. And until next time, keep your bug spray handy. You never know who might be putting eggs in your teeth.
Bye.